Hello everyone! Welcome to this tutorial on Python Basics. Today we're going to discuss about Python Shell, how we can interact with it, and how we can do activity things while actually working on some project without having to actually type a lot of code and then compile it and then see the output. So the basic agendas of this tutorial are understanding the need of Python Shell, using Python Shell as a scratchpad or calculator, and using IPython shell. So we will discuss about this Python shell or Python interpreter. And we will then move on to IPython, which is an even more sophisticated interpreter with a lot of other capabilities which the normal Python interpreter doesn't have. For starters, what we're going to do is we're going to jump back to our command prompt and shoot the Python command, and it will take us to the interpreter. So actually, in most of the cases, what the scenario is that we have to recall some code and we have to try out a couple of things. For example, if I want to see that if a variable does store a string or not, so it sort of does, and does it allow single inverted commas in Python? So it probably does. If you don't follow that, how am I storing these variables? And how am I using this entirely? You don't need to worry about it. For the time being, you just have to consider that this Python shell will be using interactively code and test out different features of Python, and maybe doing a lot of other things as well. So we have this Python interpreter shell. What I would like to show is something interesting. Whenever you start a Python interpreter, you can do something like this. Import this. So the Zen of Python by Tim Peters. It actually points out the basic philosophy behind Python programming. You can read it pretty nicely. And that would be our first input ever in Python interpreter. So congratulations. Now, since we know how to start a Python interpreter, now we've got to do something along with it. So how about use it as a normal calculator? Let's try it. My apologies, the CLS command doesn't work out here. So let's try to add two numbers. Okay, very well. Maybe a little bigger number. That works out too nicely. Subtraction works out pretty fine as well, as you can see. It gives me the exact subtraction. For multiplication, we basically used the asterisk, and it does the job. Now let's try division. 45 divided by 3. Okay, 15. Pretty straight. There was no actually a fractional value. Let's try something else. 49 by 6. So it's actually 8. However, if we wanted to have the result in decimals, we would have to do something like this. 49.0, that's actually made it a float, and then 6.0. People who don't know actually about float might want to consider for the time being that the integers that do have a fractional value can be considered in a layman's language as a float. But we'll discuss more about it. So, once we divide two floats, it actually gives us the fractional part as well, apart from the whole number. Now let's try something else. It might be some time that you actually have float operands. Operands are basically the term used for the numbers or digits involved in an operation. And the action is basically called the operator, and not to try a symbol. So having said that, let's try out a simple division. What I was saying is actually there could be cases where you have float operands but you don't want a float result, like this here happening. So you can use yet another operator called float division operator. That's double slash, double forward slash. And when we actually hit it, we see that it turns out pretty fine. There are no fractional parts. It has rounded it off entirely. Now let's try some other operator maybe. What about module as operator? Most of you might know about module operator. That's a pretty common operator and quite frequently covered in mathematics as well. So let's say if we take 8 and does module by 2, it gives us 0. Now let's try by 7 and it gives us 1. So what the operator does is it returns the remainder of the entire division process. So if we try to divide the 8 by 2, it gives us 0. And if we try to divide 7 by 2, obviously the remainder is 1. Now this module has to be kept in mind because it is intelligently used in different algorithms at different places to round off large digits and keep them under a loop. We'll discuss that later. Let's now try to do a couple of things which we might want to do. For example, I'm in this Python shell and I actually want to see what directory I'm in, or maybe what are the files in my current directory, because sooner or later you might have to invoke a function which actually takes a file name or its path as an input, but you can't actually check it. For that, you might have to take this entire trouble of quitting this entire interpreter and hitting enter, and then you can have it. Pretty hectic. We might not be needing it if we're just talking about Python interpreter. We could have done some other things like importing the OS module. There are a lot of functions, and as you can see, there's one function called list_dir. Again, I used dir function, so you might want to note that down. It's pretty handy and you might want to use it frequently. So what I'm going to do is os.listdir. I'm going to pass that current directory as a path, and it gives me a list of all the elements for all the files which are currently in our directory. So as you can see that it returns a pretty jumbled code, and you have to decode it. So yet another hectic way to actually know how many files are over there. Let's take yet another example. There could be cases in Shell when you just don't want to type the entire name because it could be pretty long. So basically shells like command prompt or shells in Linux provide this tab completion feature. So let's check it out. Can we use it in this Python interpreter? I just typed the list and try to use the tab feature, but it doesn't work. In place of that, it actually inserts a tab. So all in all, there is no tab completion feature as well. So what we're going to do exactly is we can actually use another pretty nice interpreter called IPython. And we can install it using pip package manager for Python. The command is pretty simple. Pip install IPython. We hit it, and as you can see that the requirement is already satisfied. Because I have just installed it, and it could not be the case in your scenario, and what it would do is it would download all the packages and install them. So as installed in my system, I'm just going to start it right away. Again, just to clarify, this IPython package has been kept inside the library package. So that library package variable has been defined in our environment system. So we don't have to actually go in some specific directory and invoke it from there. We will just type IPython from anywhere and it will just start fine. So let's solve the first question. Can we see the directories over here? As a matter of fact, we can. And that was just the command ls. Why it is ls? Because IPython has been created on the theme of Linux and new utilities. So over there, this package ls method is used basically for listing the files. It's actually different from Windows. In Windows, you can use that dir command, so just keep the hang of that. Dir won't actually work out here, as you can see. Dir means something entirely different. Moreover, dir is actually taken in Python already. That's the reason they had to go for ls. Now, what other feature can be used? Let's try to see. We can actually clear the screen with cls command, which was again the command prompt method, not the interpreter's method. So all in all, you can use all of the methods of command prompts over here in this running interpreter. Let's try with the date. Since the date is actually a package, it won't run. So it was an intentional mistake which I made that the names which are already colliding with the Python package names won't actually work out over here. So you might have to actually check a couple of runs to make sure that they are selected commands which you can use back and forth. Anyways, what could be yet another feature? Let's try to import a package called OS. If you're not sure about what a package is, just consider it as a functionality to import different functions. In our later chapters, we are actually going to discuss about packages and modules in a lot of detail, so you don't have to worry about it. Let's try to check out what sort of methods there are in OS. Pretty much. Let's go with this special method called start file. Or let's just for the time being stick with listdir. Here it is. So IPython is pretty cool. Let's say if you're confused with any particular package, you can just question mark it and check the entire projects and all definitions of the package and read more about it. Let's say if you're not interested in this OS package definition or explanation. What you might be looking for is some description of the function called list_dir. Here it is. So whenever you get confused, you don't actually have to go to Google and search for the definition and what is the basic user job of this particular function. What you can do is you can just write the question mark, os.listdir, and it will actually tell you what can be done. What you might want to do frequently is go to some particular package, and let's say I don't know about hummus, and I go to hummus. Here is the hummus method I just pointed out. So let's say if you don't know anything about it, but you're pretty lazy enough to go to Google and search about it as well. It's a very common thing. So what you're going to do is you can just type the question mark or ask. The name of the method is hummus, and it will tell you what it actually does. If it's not very descriptive for you and you want more examples, then you can go to Google. But most of the time, you might just want a reminder of what this function used to do in the past. So anyways, this was a very short introduction to the Python interpreter and IPython shell. There are lots of capabilities which can be done using Python, which you might want to explore. There are some nice websites which you can actually go to and find out about this IPython shell. For example, you might want to search about Python pandas. We're going to discuss about this package later on, but you can actually go there. Check out the documentation, and in the documentation, they have actually explained a lot about here, tutorials. A quick tour of the IPython notebook. If you want to pursue this one, you can on your own. Maybe you just want to get a little bit mature in this entire course. In the next tutorial, the IDE is basically a very debatable matter among many coders. But what we're going to do in the next tutorial is we're going to end up with a very perfect IDE for you, which will be pretty functional for Python in every way. Thanks a lot.